Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I tell this the way it happened, because dressing it up would only make it sound fake. It was late October last year. Shoulder season. Tourists gone. Nights cold enough to keep the snakes slow. I drove down from Louisville in a dented Subaru with a thermos of bad coffee and a digital recorder I use for freelance audio gigs. The plan was simple. Capture a sound bed of autumn woods and river echo under the limestone that runs along the Red River, near what used to be the Bell property. If you've never been out there, Robertson County looks ordinary until dusk. Then it turns into something else. The trees look older than they should, the fields feel wider, and the air gets that hollow, empty quality like a church after the lights are off. I rented a room in a cheap roadside place a few miles out. Cinder block walls painted 2 different shades of beige. The clerk didn't make eye contact, said I was late in the season to be poking around. I gave a half laugh and said I was only there for the cave's acoustics. He slid the key across the counter and told me not to leave my car under the security light near the ice machine. Power likes to go out there. I parked under that light anyway. Sunset was a smear behind the trees when I walked the trail. The path down to the cave is a dark ribbon between sycamores and rock, with the Red River whispering off to the left. I clipped the recorder to my jacket and slipped the headphones on, monitoring the noise floor like I always do. You can tell a lot about a place by what isn't there. That night, the birds cut off all at once like somebody yanked a cord. I stood in the mouth of the cave and let the recorder roll. Water dripped somewhere deep inside. Wind, maybe. My breath in the headphones. The usual. I marked the time and turned to head back while there was still a line of gray in the sky. That's when I heard it. In the left ear only. A woman, soft as breath. Don't. I froze, thinking it must have been a radio leak, somebody's phone, a stray pickup off an AM station. I tapped the headphones. If that's you, can you say that again? I whispered like an idiot. The river slid past as if nothing had happened. I stood there too long. The dark thickened and the trail got harder to read. I should have left. Maybe I wanted a story. I walked 10 more yards into the cave, lifted the mic, and panned. Opposite the water, the limestone wall threw sound right back at me, a perfect slapback echo. I asked a dumb interviewer question, because that's what my training does to me. Is anyone here? Silence. Then, under the silence, the noise floor wandered like heat shimmer. Static isn't just static if you've listened to enough of it. It's a shape. The left channel thinned out. A hiss rose up. Then it came through again, perfectly clear this time, close enough that my neck prickled. Stay. I left. Not in a movie sprint, not falling down the path and screaming. I just turned and walked, quick and steady, my teeth clenched, so hard a headache shot up the side of my skull. Every few seconds I looked back because that's what your body tells you to do no matter how useless it is. The river sound kept pace. My own footfalls sounded wrong, like they belonged to somebody behind me. Back at the motel, I dumped the audio and scrubbed through the waveform. At exactly 1942 there was my question. At 1946, a breath noise. Waveform spike, a human voice spectrum, female low mid-heavy. Stay. It wasn't wind, it wasn't water, and it wasn't across the room. It was right up on the mic. I didn't sleep. The room heater clicked on and off every 4 minutes. Each time it did, the parking lot security light outside the curtain blinked. The clerk had warned me. Around 2:30 a.m., something knocked once on the inside of the connecting door to the empty room next to mine. I whispered, "Nope," to the ceiling, because I didn't have anything better to say. At dawn, I went back. I didn't plan to. I had a checkout time and a 2-hour drive, but the recorder sat on the motel desk like a dare. I told myself I needed more room tone to sell the sound bed. The cave felt different by daylight. Mud tracks, a chew wrapper someone left, but the mouth of it still breathed that cold air that smells like pennies. I didn't step in. I stood just inside the shade and said, without any idea who I was talking to, "I'm sorry, I'm leaving. Thank you for letting me be here." It felt exactly like apologizing to a person in a doorway. On the way out, the path skirts the old field line. It's mostly scrub now, a few fence posts, a slice of sun. That's where I saw it, hung on a nail in a lean-to that had to be older than me. A tiny brown glass bottle, clouded from age, cork blackened, half full of something tar-dark that coated the inside like a film. Maybe a prop, maybe trash from some tourist prank. The smell of coins again, stronger now, like pennies in the mouth. I left it there. I didn't touch a thing. Back home, a week later, I woke to my bed nudging against the wall, not shaking, nudging. Just once. I lay there listening, hands flat on the blanket, knowing the heater wasn't on and semi-trucks weren't rattling by, and my upstairs neighbors were out of town. Nothing else happened. When I opened the laptop and pulled up the October session, file names were the same. Waveforms, too. But at the end of the main clip, after the stay, there was a third whisper I hadn't heard in the motel. It was down in the noise floor, under the hiss, where you wouldn't notice unless you boosted it. I did. Enough to hear the voice move from the left channel into the right as if someone leaned across the mic. "Jack," she breathed. "That isn't my name. I don't know whose it is." I deleted nothing. I saved everything. And sometimes, when I can't sleep, I put the headphones back on, pull the clip to the right edge of the screen, and wait for that breath that isn't mine. I tell myself I'm listening because I'm a professional. But at night, in that seam between waking and sleep, a picture shows up unauthorized in my head. A tiny bottle, black as tar, catching daylight in a lean-to on the edge of a field that doesn't want you there. It isn't the stay that gets me. It's the fact she knew a name I didn't. I grew up in Gassaway, 15 minutes from Flatwoods. Around here, you don't say monster out loud unless you want eye rolls or invitations to drink. Everybody pretends it's a joke until the lights go out. I never cared about it one way or the other until my aunt asked me to help clear out her friend's house. The friend, Mrs. May, had passed the year before. Not Kathleen. A cousin. Still, that name on an envelope does something to your stomach if you're from Braxton County. My aunt couldn't lift the boxes, and the new owners wanted the place swept. It was one of those one-story farmhouses just off the old road, a line of pines in back and the smell of oil that never leaves wooden floors. In the hallway closet, there was a shoebox full of clippings, all yellowed and brittle. Rubber band melted into itself. Flatwood stories. Handwritten notes in the margins like you'd take at church. Names I recognized. Names I didn't. A torn corner of a newspaper with E. Lemon circled. There was a flashlight at the bottom. Not modern. A big metal thing you'd keep in the trunk in the 80s. No batteries. Heavy. That night, because of course it had to be that night, I drove out to the Fisher Farm Hill. It isn't posted, and folks mostly leave it be out of habit, not fear. I parked on the shoulder, killed my lights, and took the old flashlight up the slope just to feel stupid and brave and 20 again. The sky was clear enough to count, and the air had that metallic tang that comes in early fall when someone somewhere is burning leaves. Halfway up, the dog smell hit first, not wet dog. Something that tried to be that, missed and landed on engine coolant. I talked to myself out loud. "You're smelling plants, that's what this is." and stepped into a little clearing where the grass was flattened in a circle like a truck tire had been parked there, only there weren't any tracks in or out. The flashlight didn't work, obviously. I didn't care. The stars were enough. Until they weren't. Think about a boat's red running light coming toward you across a lake at night. How it grows without getting brighter, and you can't tell how far away it is. It was like that, except it wasn't level. The glow seemed to be above me, up near the crown of a tree, and then it was exactly at my height. Not a beam, a pulse, dim, bright dim, a heartbeat. I don't carry fancy gear. I had my phone on airplane mode and a pocket knife that would have been useless against a raccoon. I felt the hair on my arms lift and laid my hand on the flashlight barrel because metal makes me feel grounded. The pulse clicked once, more sound than light, and everything in me braced like a kid hearing his dad's belt hit the door frame. "Okay," I said, as if there was a negotiation. "Okay." The pines swallowed the wind. A slow hissing rose up, steam off a cracked radiator, and I smelled that mixed oil metal again, stronger, like it was on my clothes now. I don't remember making the decision to step back. Just did, because something inside my body put a hand on my shoulder and turned me. I took 2 steps and stopped dead. There was a shape between me and the car. Not big like the stories. 10 feet tall and wearing a dress made of metal. That's theater. This shape was wrong in a small way. Its top half didn't move when the bottom did, the way a shadow should. You know how a person shifts their weight, spine and hips? This felt like 2 separate things glued together. Shoulders and head one way, the rest uncommitted. And those eyes, God, every telling gets that right. They weren't reflectors. They were a color a human doesn't make when they're scared. They were lit from the inside, and they were patient. There's a thing your mind does with animals. Bear, run, deer, freeze, dog, talk to it like a baby. My brain had no draw for whatever this was, so it gave me the closest possibility. "Owl," it said. I laughed out loud, because that's exactly what the Air Force said in the old clippings with the rubber band. The shape tilted, not like a bird on a branch, like a person deciding whether to stand up from a chair. I don't know why I did it, but I held up the dead flashlight the way you'd offer your hand to a dog to smell. The barrel felt warm. I hadn't put batteries in it, but it felt like it had been left in the sun. "Look," I said, talking to the wrong thing. "I'm leaving." When I backed away, the red pulsing moved with me, not fast, not chasing, just matching. At the edge of the trees, the smell fell away all at once, like stepping out of a locker room into cold air. I don't remember opening the car door. I remember headlights, and I remember that the first time I hit the starter, I flooded it because my foot was on the gas. Back home, the shoebox was still on my kitchen table. I slid the flashlight in next to the clippings and shut the lid. I slept on the couch with the TV on low. Around 3, a dim red glow rolled across the ceiling once. Like a cop car 2 streets over, too far to make sound, and then was gone. I took the box back the next day, put it exactly where it had been. The new owners were due in a week. I taped the closet shut with painter's tape and wrote "Hall Paint" on it in Sharpie, as if that would keep anyone out. There's a story people tell about the old witnesses, how their eyes changed after. Not color, focus, how they'd be mid-sentence and glance at the window like they were checking to see whether a barn light was still on. I used to think that meant fear. I don't think so anymore. It's not terror that stays, it's awareness. The knowledge that when the trees go quiet all at once and the air tastes like hot metal, you can find your way to your car. You can drive, you can sleep with the TV on, but something that isn't supposed to be able to find you will know the shape of your house and the color of your ceiling and the sound your breath makes when you pretend to be asleep. If you're still listening, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or a comment helps keep them alive. I didn't go out there to mess with anything. I went because my grandfather used to park at Wiseman's View when he needed to think. He'd tell me, some places make a man small in a way that feels like mercy. He died in May. By August, I'd started keeping his old habits like they were passwords. Bad coffee, early mornings, empty overlooks. The first night I didn't see a thing. The second, a ranger truck idled at the pull-off for 10 minutes and left. I stayed, listening for cicadas and counting satellites, feeling like a kid who stayed out too late. It was the third night when the lights showed up. Small at first, and so far out over the gorge that I didn't trust my eyes. Imagine a lantern on a string, except the string is the air, and the person holding it is careful, like they're showing you something fragile. It rose from below the ridge line, warmer than starlight, a soft yellow first, then orange. It hovered level with the overlook, then slid sideways in a way that didn't map onto how your brain knows mountains work. I covered my eyes and peeked between my fingers, because that's what you do when your body tries to be a child and an adult at the same time. There were 3 of them now. 2 dimmer, 1 steady. They moved like a school of fish. Split, rejoin, turn on a beat you can't hear. You can watch videos, read every theory. Gas, geology, headlights, plasma, God, but your chest makes its own call in the moment. Mine said, loud and clear, be respectful. I raised my hand, as if my grandfather was across the valley and I could wave. I don't expect you to believe this part. One of the lights broke formation, floated toward the overlook to a distance I can only describe as uncomfortably close, and paused. Then it rose, slowly, as if to say, you. I breathed the way you breathe when a deer walks out onto the trail and decides not to bolt. The night insects sang like someone turned up a volume knob. I whispered, I miss him. Not to the air, not to the lights, just to have the words leave my mouth and be visible to whatever wanted to catch them. The light pulsed. Once. Not bright, not showy. A heartbeat that matched mine. A second light rose, drifting out of alignment with the third, and then stopped dead, as if whoever was playing with the string wanted to make sure I knew this wasn't a trick of my eyes. I didn't cry until I tried to say, thank you, and realized whispering was the only speed I had left. I stood there until damp creek air made my shirt heavy. I nodded like a fool. On the far ridge, the smallest light darted twice, like a kid who can't stand still during a prayer, and then the 3 of them sank together as if someone slid them back into a drawer. The drive down the mountain felt like breaking curfew. Back at the motel, a 2-story place outside Linville with ice buckets stacked like helmets, I slept with the curtains open. At 4:17 a.m., I woke to a pale orange glow at the ceiling, not bright enough to light the room. Just enough to make me feel watched in a patient, kind way. The way you watch a kid cross the street and don't say anything because they need to do it themselves. In the morning, I checked my phone. No alerts. No weather weirdness. I scrolled through the photos I thought I'd taken and found only black rectangles with gray noise. One frame, just one, showed a smear of orange in the lower third, like a thumbprint on glass. On top of it, for no good reason, was a crescent shape that shouldn't have been there. Not a lens flare. A cut-out curve the color of midnight. I don't know what that means. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. When I told my mother, she didn't say I was crazy. She asked whether I had said thank you out loud. I said I had. She told me about my grandfather driving up there after his own father died, how he came back quiet and gentle like a man who had put something down. He always said the mountain listens, she told me. That was enough for him. It's enough for me too most days. But sometimes I wake at 4:17, exactly like an appointment, and I lie very still, listening for insects that aren't in my room, watching the corner of the ceiling for a color my eyes don't see in daylight. I know what I want that glow to be. I don't ask for it. I just whisper, "Thank you," into the dark and let the night decide whether to answer. I was 9 when the bridge fell. Old enough to be told the truth, young enough to be told a different truth later. The first one came in the kitchen at Twin Oaks, my mom's hand around a jelly glass of iced tea that shook without her meaning it to. It was a chain, she told me, a crack in the iron. Sometimes things break all at once. The second truth came after I turned 30, when you can ask your parents questions they would have lied about when you were young. He saw it, she said. That thing. Twice. My father drove a delivery truck for a hardware supplier in Gallipolis. He made the crossing every weekday. Morning out, evening back, radio low, thermos coffee warm until about halfway home. He wasn't a storyteller. He didn't drink. Church every Sunday. Union dues paid. Hands that could fix anything in the house except the TV when it went to snow. 2 weeks before the collapse, he told my mother he'd seen a big bird near the TNT area. She said he used the word bird, but all the rest didn't fit. It moved without flapping, it turned without turning, and when it crossed the road ahead of him, the radio blew to static for 3 breaths. He didn't tell anyone else. You didn't back then. You still don't, not if you want to keep your job. The second time was the night before the bridge came down. He had a Christmas tree roped to the roof, bought at a lot near the Dairy Queen. He told my mother he drove under a shape bigger than a billboard that shouldn't have been there. He didn't slow down. He didn't honk. He held his breath and rolled on through like a boy who learned somewhere along the line that if you don't flinch, some things will pass over you. On the 15th, my father was late leaving the warehouse. A guy named Pete needed to swap shifts before kids' recital. My father took the last load out. He would be crossing the bridge at rush hour with everybody else. The sound of the collapse traveled in a way everyone in town claims they can still feel in their teeth. My mother says she didn't hear it. She felt the silence after, the way the radio got sweet and low like it does when a storm is near. She stood at the window and watched the corner where the news would be, before news traveled in everything you touch. People here will tell you there were signs for months. Dreams of water, burned out taillights in pairs on the bridge, red and red, then none. Men who said their dogs howled when they came home, Mary Hire taking notes until her hand cramped, then hiding those notebooks like a person hides bank bonds. I can't give you engineering. I can tell you what my father said to my mother when he made it home late, white-faced and shaking, having turned around on the Ohio side because of the screaming and the lights. He said, "I've heard the Lord's voice twice in my life. Neither time was in a church." He wouldn't give details. He wouldn't talk about the shape or the red eyes or the way his hair stood up when he crossed the TNT access road. He wouldn't even let my mother throw away the thermos he'd used that day, dented where it must have hit the cab floor when he braked too fast. "Keep it," he said, "as a reminder." A reminder of what? She asked him that. He said, "A bridge isn't just steel. It's agreement." We moved 3 years later, but that conversation lives in me like a thread that doesn't dissolve. I came back for the 50th anniversary. Point Pleasant has leaned into the legend in a way that makes out-of-towners smirk. They buy the T-shirts and the festival corn dogs and pose by the statue with the wings and the eyes. I don't smirk. I've seen how people fling laughter at things that scare them. I drove out to where the new bridge throws its clean sweep across the water. I parked and walked as close as you can get. 2 fishermen stood in hoodies, lines whispering into the dark. Someone's Bluetooth speaker carried a song too tinny to identify. The wind off the river tasted exactly like it did when I was 9, a mix of wet metal and river rock and something like pennies on your tongue. I didn't see a shape. I didn't need to. My father's thermos is in my hall closet, dented on one side, paint scratched to bare. I don't keep coffee in it. I keep finished nails. I say that out loud sometimes. I keep nails in my father's thermos. It makes me feel like I'm carrying pieces of a bridge in a container that kept a man alive on a day when the water wanted him. People who don't believe in omens like to accuse those who do of wishful thinking. I don't think there's anything wishful about waking at 2:12 a.m. sometimes, only on Decembers, to the sensation that something big is passing overhead without touching you. I don't think there's anything wishful about the way the new bridge hums in a key you can't hear with your ears and the low-frequency ache that hits the soft part behind your eyes when you stand beneath it too long. If you want the last line, here. Some say whatever it was left when the silver did. They say the warning came and went, job done, nothing to see. I can't argue with believers in tidy endings. I can only tell you that last week I crossed alone at midnight, rain fretting at the windshield, and the radio went quiet on a song I love. Not off. Quiet. I didn't change the dial. I didn't reach for my phone. I put my hand on the thermos on the passenger seat and said to the empty cab, because it was the only thing that felt honest, I hear you. And the strange part is that the feeling that answered wasn't fear. It was grief, old, intelligent, and not entirely ours. My great-grandmother was half Cherokee, which means I grew up with stories that weren't meant for children, but somehow always found their way to us anyway. The Wampus cat was one of them. She'd tell it in pieces, never all at once, like she was afraid to give the whole thing shape in one sitting. There was a woman, she'd start, always the same way, who wanted to know what she wasn't supposed to know. I was 12 the first time I heard the whole story. We were staying at my great-grandmother's place in the mountains outside Cherokee, North Carolina. The power had gone out during a thunderstorm, and we were sitting around candles in the kitchen. My mother had gone to bed early with a headache, and it was just me and the old woman, listening to rain hit the tin roof like handfuls of gravel. She wrapped herself in the hide of a mountain cat, my great-grandmother said, her voice dropping to that whisper she used when she talked about the old times. Thought she could watch the men's hunting ceremony without being seen. Thought she was clever. The way she told it, the woman had been warned. Everyone knew the hunting rituals were sacred, that women weren't allowed to witness them. But curiosity is a hungry thing, and it had been eating at her for years. She wanted to understand the power the men claimed to have, wanted to see for herself what happened in those secret ceremonies deep in the forest. The spirits knew she was there, my great-grandmother continued, her eyes reflecting the candlelight in a way that made me think of animal eyes in the dark. They always know, and they don't forgive. The transformation happened slowly at first. The cat hide began to merge with her skin, becoming part of her instead of just covering her. Her fingernails grew into claws, her teeth sharpened into fangs, and her mind started to change from human thoughts to animal instincts. By the time the ceremony ended, she was no longer woman or cat, but something caught between the two worlds, a creature of eternal punishment. I didn't think much about the story after that night. It was just another piece of family folklore, something to file away with the other tales my great-grandmother told. But that changed when I went camping in the Smoky Mountains with some friends the summer I turned 16. We'd hiked about 5 miles into the back country and set up camp near a creek that ran cold and clear over smooth stones. It was the kind of place that feels untouched by the modern world, where you can almost imagine what the mountains were like before roads and power lines carved them up. We built a fire as the sun went down and sat around it telling stories and drinking the beer we'd smuggled in. Around midnight, when the fire had burned down to coals and most of my friends had crawled into the tents, I stayed outside to watch the stars. The night was clear and still, with just the sound of the creek and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. I was thinking about my great-grandmother's stories about the old Cherokee who used to live in these mountains when I heard something moving in the woods. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a bear. But the movement was wrong, too deliberate, too careful. Whatever it was watching us, staying just outside the circle of light from our dying fire. I grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, but the beam didn't reach far enough to show me anything except trees and shadows. That's when I heard the voice. It was a woman's voice, but not quite human. There was something wild about it, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. She was speaking Cherokee, words I didn't understand, but somehow felt in my bones. The voice seemed to be coming from different directions, as if the speaker was moving through the trees in a circle around our camp. I should have woken my friends. I should have gotten into my tent and zipped it shut and waited for morning. Instead, I found myself walking toward the voice, flashlight beam dancing ahead of me through the trees. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the same curiosity that had driven the woman in my great-grandmother's story. I followed the voice deeper into the woods, my flashlight creating a small bubble of light in the vast darkness. The Cherokee words continued, sometimes close enough that I could feel breath on my neck, sometimes so distant they seemed to echo from the mountains themselves. I walked for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my sense of direction completely gone. Then I saw her. She was standing in a small clearing, caught in my flashlight beam like a deer frozen by headlights. But she wasn't a deer. She wasn't quite human either. She stood upright like a woman, but her body was covered in dark fur, and her hands ended in claws that caught the light. Her face was the worst part, human features stretched and distorted, with eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like mirrors. She looked at me for a long moment, her head tilted to one side in a gesture that was almost curious. Then she spoke, and this time the words were in English. "You have her blood," she said, her voice carrying that same wild quality I'd heard before. "I can smell it on you." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I wanted to scream, but my throat had closed up tight. All I could do was stand there and stare at this thing that shouldn't exist, this creature from my great-grandmother's stories made real. "She told you about me," the Wampus cat continued. "The old woman. She told you what happens when you want to know what you're not supposed to know." I managed to nod, though I'm not sure she could see the movement in the darkness beyond my flashlight. "Good," she said. "Then you understand why I'm here." She took a step toward me, and I could see her more clearly. The transformation was incomplete. Patches of human skin showed through the fur, and her face was a horrible mixture of woman and cat. She was exactly as my great-grandmother had described her, a creature caught between two worlds, neither fully human nor fully animal. "I've been waiting," she said. "Waiting for someone with the old blood to find me. Someone who could carry the story forward." I found my voice then, though it came out as barely a whisper. "What do you want?" "To be remembered," she said. "To be more than just a story told around campfires. The old woman is dying. Soon there will be no one left who knows the true telling." She was right. My great-grandmother had been sick for months, though she tried to hide it from us. The doctors said it was her heart, that she didn't have much time left. "Will you remember me?" the Wampus cat asked. "Will you tell them what happens when sacred laws are broken?" I nodded again, more firmly this time. She smiled then, and it was the most heartbreaking thing I'd ever seen. For just a moment, I could see the woman she had been before the transformation, the curious soul who had wanted nothing more than to understand the mysteries that surrounded her. "Then my punishment has meaning," she said. "And perhaps, someday, it will end." She turned and walked back into the trees, her form dissolving into shadow until I couldn't tell where she ended and the forest began. I stood there for a long time, my flashlight beam playing over empty trees, before I finally found my way back to camp. My friends were still asleep when I crawled into my tent. I lay awake until dawn, listening to the creek and thinking about what I'd seen. When we hiked out the next morning, I looked for signs of the clearing where I'd met her, but I couldn't find it. It was as if it had never existed. My great-grandmother died 2 months later, At her funeral, I told my mother about the encounter in the woods. She listened without interrupting, her face growing paler as I spoke. "She came to you," my mother said when I finished. "Grandmother always said she would someday, that the Wampus cat would find someone with the blood to carry on the story. I've been carrying it ever since. Not just the story my great-grandmother told, but the memory of that night in the mountains when I met the creature herself. I've told it to my own children, and someday they'll tell it to theirs, keeping alive the warning about what happens when we reach for knowledge that isn't meant for us. Sometimes, on nights when the wind is right and the mountains feel closer than they should, I think I can hear her voice calling from the deep woods. Still speaking Cherokee words I don't understand, still carrying the burden of her eternal punishment, still waiting for the day when her story might finally set her free." I heard this story from my grandfather, who heard it from his grandfather, who was there when it happened. That's how these mountain stories work. They pass down through families like inherited scars, and you carry them whether you want to or not. Around 1900, there was a woman named Grandma Thorne who lived way back in the hollers of Clay County, West Virginia, in a place folks called Booger Hole. Even the name should have been warning enough, but people back then were harder, more practical. They didn't move away from a place just because of what it was called. Grandma Thorne wasn't her real name, but it's what everyone called her. She was married to one of the Thorne boys, and when he died young, mine accident, they said, though some whispered it was something else. She stayed on in their cabin by Otter Creek. Stayed on and got strange. My great-great-grandfather used to deliver supplies to the remote homesteads, and Booger Hole was one of his stops. He'd tell my grandfather about the feeling that place gave him, how the trees grew too close together and the creek ran too quiet, how Grandma Thorne's cabin sat in a clearing that never seemed to get full sunlight, even at noon. She had a way about her, he'd say. Could look at you and know things she shouldn't know, could make things happen that shouldn't happen. The stories started small, livestock getting sick after Grandma Thorne had words with their owners, crops failing in fields that bordered her property, children coming down with fevers after they'd been caught playing too close to her cabin. Mountain folk are superstitious by nature, but they're also practical. They know the difference between coincidence and something else. Grandma Thorne made no secret of what she was. She'd tell anyone who'd listen about the night she climbed the hill behind her cabin and made her bargain with the devil. How she'd fired a gun through a white handkerchief at the sun and watched it bleed. How she'd cursed God 3 times and felt the darkness flow into her like cold water. Power's got to come from somewhere, she'd say, and some of us ain't afraid to pay the price. The thing about mountain communities is that they'll tolerate a lot. They'll put up with a strange old woman who talks to herself and keeps cats that watch you too closely. They'll cross themselves when she passes and make sure their children stay away from her property, but they won't act unless they have to. That too came when Samuel Morrison disappeared. Morrison was a good man, the kind who helped his neighbors and paid his debts and never caused trouble for anybody. He'd gone to town for supplies and never made it home. His wife waited 3 days before she raised the alarm, and then every man in the valley turned out to search for him. They found his wagon by the creek, horse still hitched but nervous as a cat in a thunderstorm. His supplies were scattered around like he'd stopped sudden and gotten out in a hurry. But there was no sign of Morrison himself, no tracks leading away from the wagon, no indication of what might have happened to him. That's when Grandma Thorne made her mistake. She started talking about Morrison like she knew where he was. Not in a helpful way. She never offered to help with the search or show anyone where to look. She just made comments, little things that suggested she knew more than she should about what had happened to him. Poor Samuel, she'd say to anyone who'd listen. Shame about the way he went. Shame about where he ended up. When people pressed her for details, she'd claim the information came from her spirits, from the dark forces she'd made her bargain with. But her knowledge was too specific, too detailed. She knew things about Morrison's final hours that no spirit could have told her, things that only someone who'd been there could have known. The men of the valley started meeting in secret, talking in low voices about what needed to be done. Mountain justice is different from the kind you get in courtrooms. It's older, more direct, and it doesn't require proof beyond reasonable doubt. It just requires certainty. They were certain. The night they came for her, Grandma Thorne was sitting on her porch like she was waiting for them. My great-great-grandfather was one of the men who went, though he never talked about the details. He'd only say that justice was done and the valley was safer for it. They found Morrison's body where she said it would be, in a sinkhole about a mile from her cabin. What was left of him, anyway. The animals had been at him, but there was enough to see that he hadn't died natural. There were marks on the bones that didn't come from any animal they knew. Grandma Thorne died the way she lived, alone and unrepentant. They shot her through her cabin window while she slept, one clean shot that ended her story, quick and final. When they searched the cabin afterward, they found things that made strong men sick to their stomachs. Jars of things that shouldn't be preserved, books written in languages that hurt to look at, and a smell that clung to everything like smoke from a fire that wouldn't go out. They burned the cabin and everything in it, but the smell took months to fade from the valley. Some say it never really went away, that you can still catch a whiff of it on certain nights when the wind is right and the creek runs low. My grandfather used to say that Grandma Thorne got what she bargained for in the end. She'd wanted power over life and death, and she got it. But power like that comes with a price that keeps collecting long after you think you've paid it in full. The place where her cabin stood is still empty. Trees won't grow there, and animals won't cross it. The locals call it dead ground now, and they mark it on their maps so strangers won't try to build there, because some things, once they're poisoned, stay poisoned. I've been to Booger Hole myself, years later when I was researching family history. The creek still runs quiet, and the trees still grow too close together. There's a depression in the earth where the cabin used to stand, and the ground around it has a different color, like it's been stained by something that won't wash clean. I didn't stay long. There was a feeling about the place that made my skin crawl, a sense that I was being watched by something that didn't want me there. When I got back to my car, I found scratches on the paint that hadn't been there before, 4 parallel lines like claw marks running from the hood to the trunk. Could have been a bear, I told myself. Could have been anything, but I knew better. Some things don't stay buried, no matter how deep you dig the hole. And some bargains echo through generations, waiting for someone foolish enough to think they can handle the price. The witch of Booger Hole is dead and gone, but her story lives on in the families who remember what happened when evil took root in their valley. We tell it to our children not to scare them, but to warn them, to make sure they understand that there are lines you don't cross, no matter how much power waits on the other side. Because power like that always collects its due, one way or another. And the payment never stops coming. I wasn't raised Catholic, but I married one, and that's how I ended up at Priestfield on a weekend retreat that changed everything I thought I knew about the supernatural. My wife had been going there for years, said it was a place where she could feel closer to God. I went along to keep the peace, expecting nothing more than bad coffee and earnest discussions about Scripture. Priestfield sits on land that's been sacred longer than anyone wants to admit. The retreat center is modern enough, built in the 1970s with that institutional brick and glass look that screams budget construction. But the grounds themselves feel older, weighted with history that presses down on you like humidity before a storm. Sister Margaret, who ran the place, was one of those nuns who looked like she could arm wrestle the devil and win. She gave us the tour on Friday afternoon, pointing out the chapel and the dining hall and the walking trails that wound through the woods. But it was when we got to the old cemetery that her voice changed. This is where it all began, she said, stopping beside a simple stone marker that looked newer than the graves around it. Adam Livingston is buried here, the man whose generosity made this place possible. She told us the story then, standing there in the afternoon sun while the wind moved through the trees like whispered prayers. How Livingston had been a Protestant farmer who'd refused to call a Catholic priest for a dying stranger. How that refusal had brought down a haunting so terrible that it drove him to convert and donate his land to the church. The phenomena lasted for months, Sister Margaret said, her voice matter-of-fact in the way that only nuns can manage when discussing the miraculous. Objects moving on their own, mysterious fires, the sound of invisible scissors cutting cloth into crescent shapes. It only stopped when Father Cahill performed the proper burial rites for the poor soul who died without them. I was polite but skeptical. Ghost stories are one thing, but I'd never put much stock in tales of supernatural revenge and religious intervention. My wife squeezed my hand and gave me that look that said, "Be nice." So I nodded and asked appropriate questions and kept my doubts to myself. That night, I found out why they called it Priestfield. We were staying in the guest quarters, a long, low building with individual rooms that felt like a cross between a monastery and a budget motel. The walls were thin, and you could hear everything: footsteps in the hallway, doors closing, the murmur of conversations from neighboring rooms. I was lying in bed around 2 a.m., listening to my wife's steady breathing and trying to fall asleep, when I heard the scissors. Snip, snip, snip. Rhythmic, deliberate, like someone cutting fabric with surgical precision. The sound was coming from somewhere in our room, but I couldn't pinpoint the location. I sat up and turned on the bedside lamp, squinting in the sudden brightness. Nothing. Just our clothes hanging in the closet, our suitcases on the floor, the same generic furniture you'd find in any retreat center. I checked the bathroom, looked under the bed, even opened the window to see if the sound might be coming from outside. Nothing. I turned off the light and lay back down. Within minutes, the cutting started again. Snip, snip, snip. This time I didn't turn on the light. I lay there in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of invisible scissors working their way through invisible cloth. The sound seemed to move around the room, sometimes close enough that I could feel the displacement of air, sometimes distant like an echo from another time. My wife slept through it all. In the morning, she woke up refreshed and cheerful, talking about how peaceful the night had been. I didn't mention the scissors. What was I going to say? That I'd heard ghost sounds in a place famous for ghost sounds. She would have thought I was either lying or losing my mind. But then I found the crescents. I was getting dressed when I noticed them, perfect crescent-shaped cuts in the hem of my shirt, so clean and precise they looked like they'd been made with surgical instruments. The fabric wasn't torn or frayed. It was cut, as if someone had used the sharpest scissors in the world to remove small, moon-shaped pieces of cotton. I checked my wife's clothes. Same thing. Tiny crescents cut from the sleeves of her blouse, from the collar of her jacket, from the cuffs of her pants. Not enough to ruin the garments, just enough to let us know that something had been busy while we slept. I showed her the cuts over breakfast. She examined them with the calm attention of someone who'd grown up Catholic and wasn't easily rattled by evidence of the supernatural. "It's the Priestfield phenomenon," she said, buttering her toast like we were discussing the weather. "Sister Margaret mentioned it yesterday. The spirit still manifests sometimes, especially for first-time visitors. It's not malevolent, just letting you know it's still here." "You're telling me a dead man cut up our clothes?" "Not the dead man. The phenomenon, the spiritual energy that was created by the original haunting. It's like an echo that never quite fades away." I wanted to argue, to find a rational explanation for what had happened. Maybe someone had broken into our room. Maybe the cuts had been there all along and we just hadn't noticed. Maybe I was having some kind of breakdown brought on by sleeping in an unfamiliar place. But I knew better. I'd heard the scissors. I'd felt the presence in our room, the sense of something old and patient working its way through tasks that had been interrupted centuries ago. Whatever had haunted Adam Livingston was still there, still cutting cloth into crescent shapes, still making its presence known to anyone who cared to notice. The rest of the weekend passed quietly. We attended masses in the chapel, walked the trails through the woods, participated in discussions about faith and doubt in the mystery of divine grace. I found myself paying closer attention to the other guests, watching for signs that they'd experienced something similar to what had happened to us. A few had. I caught fragments of whispered conversations, mentions of strange sounds in the night, of objects that had been moved while they slept, of feelings of being watched by something benevolent but unmistakably present. The long-time visitors seemed to take it in stride, as if supernatural manifestations were just part of the Priestfield experience. On Sunday morning, before we left, I sought out Sister Margaret. I found her in the chapel, kneeling before the altar, in the kind of prayer that looks like hard work. I waited until she finished, then approached her with the shirt in my hands. "This happened Friday night," I said, showing her the crescent cuts. She examined the fabric with the same calm attention my wife had shown, running her fingers over the precise cuts with something that looked like affection. "He's still here," she said simply. "The poor soul who died without his last rites. Father Cahill's intervention gave him peace, but it didn't make him disappear entirely. He stays close to this place, close to the spot where his spiritual needs were finally met." "But why the cutting? Why the crescents?" "Who knows? Maybe it was something he did in life. A tailor, perhaps, or someone who worked with fabric. Or maybe it's just his way of saying hello, of letting us know that death isn't the end of the story." She handed the shirt back to me with a smile that was both sad and hopeful. "Keep it," she said. "Consider it a blessing. Not everyone gets a personal message from the other side." I've kept the shirt for 15 years now. The crescents have faded a bit, but they're still there, still perfectly cut, still serving as proof that some things transcend our understanding of how the world works. I've been back to Priestfield a dozen times since that first visit, and I've never heard the scissors again. But I've felt the presence, the sense of something watching and waiting and working its way through tasks that have no end. My wife says it's because I'm not a first-timer anymore, that the spirit only manifests fully for people who need to be convinced of its reality. Maybe she's right. Or maybe I've just learned to listen for different things, to pay attention to the subtle signs of spiritual activity that surround us all the time if we know how to look. Either way, Priestfield changed me. It taught me that faith isn't just about believing in things you can't see. It's about being open to experiences that challenge everything you thought you knew about the nature of reality. It's about accepting that some mysteries are meant to be lived with rather than solved, and that the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds is a lot thinner than most of us want to admit. I still have the shirt. Sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly skeptical about the supernatural, I take it out and run my fingers over those perfect crescent cuts. They remind me that there are forces in this world that operate according to laws we don't understand, and that sometimes the best response to mystery isn't explanation, but acceptance. The dead don't always stay buried. Sometimes they linger, not out of malevolence, but out of love, waiting to remind us that the story doesn't end when the heart stops beating. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, they leave us small signs of their presence. Crescent-shaped cuts in fabric, the sound of scissors in the night, the knowledge that we are not alone in this vast and mysterious universe. My uncle worked the mines for 37 years before black lung finally got him. Harold Jenkins was his name, and he had stories that would make you think twice about going underground for any reason. Most of them he kept to himself, but toward the end, when the oxygen tank was his constant companion and he knew he didn't have long, he started talking about the things he'd seen in the deep tunnels of Appalachia. There's places down there that ain't on any map, he'd wheeze, his voice barely audible above the hiss of the oxygen machine. Places where the rock's older than it should be, where the air tastes different, where men go in and don't come out. I was helping take care of him during his final months, and on the bad nights when the pain kept him awake, he'd tell me about the disappearances. Not the ones that made the papers. Cave-ins and gas explosions and equipment failures that everyone could understand. The other kind, the ones that didn't make sense, where experienced miners would walk into familiar tunnels and simply vanish without a trace. Bobby Hutchinson and his nephew Michael, Uncle Harold said one night, staring at the ceiling like he could see through it to something beyond. Best miners I ever knew. Could navigate those tunnels blindfolded. Went down to inspect a section we'd just reopened, and that was the last anyone saw of them. He told me how the search had gone on for over a week, how they'd brought in dogs and equipment and specialists from other mines. How they'd found the men's gear scattered through the tunnels in ways that made no sense. Hard hat here, gas detector there, radio equipment spread out like someone had been marking a trail. But here's the thing, Uncle Harold said, his eyes focusing on mine with an intensity that made me lean closer. The tunnel went deeper than it was supposed to. Way deeper. We found passages that weren't on any of our maps, chambers that looked like they'd been carved by something other than mining equipment. The rescue teams had been spooked by what they'd found down there, tunnels that extended far beyond what the geological surveys indicated was possible. Areas where the rock formations were unlike anything found elsewhere in the mine. Sections where the air felt different, colder, thicker, like it was carrying the weight of centuries. Some of the boys said they heard things, Uncle Harold continued. Voices calling from way down in the deep places. Footsteps that echoed from tunnels we'd never dug. Sounds like machinery running where no machinery should be. The official report blamed the disappearance on the men getting lost in an unmapped section of the mine. But Uncle Harold and the other miners knew better. Bobby Hutchinson had been working those tunnels for 20 years. He knew every inch of them, every twist and turn and dead end. He didn't get lost. There was another case, Uncle Harold said, his breathing becoming more labored as the story went on. Thomas, Garrett, good man, family man. Went down to service some ventilation equipment and never came back up. We found his tools scattered all through the tunnel, but the pattern was wrong. Looked like he'd been moving deeper into the mountain instead of working on the equipment near the entrance. They'd found footprints in the coal dust, clear as day, showing Garrett walking steadily away from his assigned work area and into sections of the mine that hadn't been worked in years. The prints led to passages that the search team swore hadn't been there the week before, tunnels that seemed to have opened up overnight like wounds in the earth. The old-timers had theories, Uncle Harold said. Said some shafts went deeper than they should, connected to natural cave systems that followed their own rules. Said there were places underground where the normal world ended and something else began. He told me about the stories that got passed down through mining families, whispered conversations in company towns, about tunnels that called to certain men, about miners who reported hearing their names spoken from deep in unexplored passages, about sections of mine where even the most experienced workers felt an overwhelming urge to keep walking, to follow the tunnels deeper and deeper into the heart of the mountain. It was like the mountain was hungry, Uncle Harold said, like it wanted to pull men into itself and never let them go. The mining companies dealt with the disappearances by sealing off the problem areas. Officially, they cited safety concerns or economic factors that made continued operation impractical. But the miners understood what was really happening. Certain parts of the underground world had become too dangerous to enter, not because of conventional hazards, but because of something far more mysterious and threatening. They'd close off a tunnel after a disappearance, Uncle Harold explained. Board it up, mark it as unsafe, tell everyone to stay away. But sometimes, late at night when the mine was supposed to be empty, you'd hear sounds coming from behind those boards. Tapping, like someone trying to get out. voices calling for help from places where no one should be. The psychological toll on the mining community was enormous. Families lived with the constant fear that their loved ones might simply vanish during a routine shift. Children grew up knowing that their fathers went to work each day in a place where men disappeared without explanation. The very ground beneath their feet became a source of anxiety and dread. Uncle Harold had his own close call in 1983. He was working alone in a section of tunnel that was considered completely safe, checking for gas leaks with equipment he'd used hundreds of times before. He was making his way through a familiar passage when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There was a side tunnel I'd never seen before, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Couldn't have been there the day before. I'd walked that same route a dozen times. But there it was, opening up into the rock like a mouth. The new tunnel was different from the others. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and the air that flowed from it carried a smell like old copper pennies. Uncle Harold stood at the entrance, shining his headlamp into the darkness, and felt an almost overwhelming urge to step inside. It was calling to me, he said. I know how that sounds, but I could feel it pulling at me, like there was something down there I needed to see. Something important. He'd taken 3 steps into the tunnel before he caught himself. The rational part of his mind was screaming warnings, reminding him of all the men who disappeared after venturing into unmapped passages. He'd backed out slowly, never taking his eyes off the tunnel mouth, and reported it to his supervisor. They sent a team down the next day, Uncle Harold said. Found nothing, just solid rock where the tunnel had been, like it had never existed at all. But Uncle Harold knew what he'd seen, and he knew that if he'd taken one more step, if he'd followed that tunnel deeper into the mountain, he would have become another disappearance, another mystery for the families to grieve over and the mining company to explain away. The mountain remembers, he said during one of our last conversations. It's been here longer than we can imagine, and it's got its own ways of doing things. Sometimes it takes what it wants, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. He died on a Tuesday morning in March, his lungs finally giving out after decades of breathing coal dust and whatever else lived in the deep places of the earth. At his funeral, I met other retired miners who'd worked with him over the years. They all had stories similar to his, tales of disappearances and strange tunnels and the feeling that something ancient and hungry lived in the deepest parts of the mines. One old man, bent and weathered like a piece of driftwood, pulled me aside after the service. Harold was one of the lucky ones, he said. He heard the mountain calling, but he had sense enough not to answer. Not everyone was so smart. He told me about his own son, who'd disappeared in a mine collapse in 1995. Officially, the boy had been caught in a cave-in and his body never recovered. But the old man knew better. There wasn't no cave-in, he said, his eyes bright with unshed tears. The tunnel was intact when they found it, but there was a new passage leading off from where he'd been working, going deeper into the mountain than any of our surveys showed was possible. They sealed it up quick, didn't want anyone else getting curious about where it led. I've thought about these stories often in the years since Uncle Harold's death, about the men who disappeared into tunnels that shouldn't have existed, following passages that led to places beyond human understanding, about the families who never got answers, never got closure, never got to bury their dead. Modern mining operations have moved away from the deep shaft mining that characterized the industry during the peak years of the disappearances. Surface mining is safer, more efficient, less likely to encounter the mysterious passages that swallowed so many men whole. But some of the old mines remain accessible, and urban explorers and paranormal investigators still venture into them, looking for evidence of what might have happened to the missing miners. Some of them find more than they bargained for. There are reports of footprints in undisturbed coal dust, of personal items that appear to have been recently placed, despite the fact that the mines have been closed for decades. of voices echoing from passages that lead deeper into the mountains than any geological survey suggests is possible. The families of the disappeared miners have formed informal support groups sharing stories and theories about what might have happened to their loved ones. Some believe the men are still alive somewhere in the deep places of the earth, trapped in underground chambers or lost in cave systems that connect to the mines. Others think they've passed into some other realm entirely, following tunnels that lead not just deeper into the mountain, but into dimensions beyond human comprehension. I don't know what happened to Bobby Hutchinson and Michael Hutchinson and Thomas Garrett and all the others who walked into familiar tunnels and never walked out. But I know that Uncle Harold was right about one thing. The mountains are older than we can imagine, and they have their own ways of doing things. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling through the hills and the house creaks and settles around me, I think about those missing miners. I wonder if they're still down there somewhere, still walking through passages that exist outside our understanding of space and time, still following tunnels that lead deeper and deeper into the heart of mysteries we were never meant to solve. And I'm grateful that Uncle Harold had the sense to step back from that tunnel when it called to him. Because some invitations, no matter how compelling they might seem, are better left unanswered. I don't usually ask, but if this story is getting under your skin, show it some love. It really helps. I was 23 when I first saw the demon dog, though I didn't know that's what it was called until years later. I was working as a photographer for a small magazine that covered Appalachian folklore and history, and I'd driven to Valle Crucis to document the old cemetery at St. John's Church for an article about pioneer burial grounds. Valle Crucis is one of those places that feels different from the moment you arrive. The valley sits cupped between mountains like hands, holding water, and there's a quality to the light there that makes everything look slightly unreal, like you're seeing the world through old glass. The church itself is beautiful in that stark mountain way, grey stone and simple lines, built to last through whatever the mountains might throw at it. I arrived late in the afternoon, planning to shoot during the golden hour when the light would be soft and warm. The cemetery spreads out around the church like a stone garden, with headstones dating back to the 1860s, marking the graves of farmers and merchants and mountain families who'd carved lives out of the hard ground of western North Carolina. I was working my way through the oldest section, photographing weathered stones and trying to capture the way the evening light played across the carved names and dates, when I became aware that I wasn't alone. It started as just a feeling, that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you someone's watching. I looked around, but saw nothing except graves and trees and the long shadows of late afternoon. I kept shooting, but the feeling persisted. More than that, it intensified. By the time I reached the far corner of the cemetery, where the oldest graves clustered beneath a stand of ancient oaks, I was genuinely nervous. I've spent a lot of time in isolated places, and I know the difference between normal solitude and something else. This was something else. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow among the headstones, darker and more solid than the shadows cast by the trees, but as I watched, it began to move with a purpose that no shadow should have. It was low to the ground, moving between the graves with a fluid grace that reminded me of water flowing around obstacles. I raised my camera instinctively, the way photographers do when they see something unusual. The telephoto lens brought the shape into focus, and what I saw through the viewfinder made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped the camera. It was a dog, but not like any dog I'd ever seen. It was massive, easily the size of a small horse, with a head that seemed too large for even its enormous body. Its fur was black as coal, but it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a void in the shape of an animal. And its eyes, God, those eyes. They glowed with a red light that had nothing to do with reflected illumination. It was an Internal fire, burning with an intensity that made me think of furnaces and forge fires and things that burn without consuming themselves. When those eyes fixed on me, I felt something deep in my chest clench like a fist. I managed to press the shutter release, though I'm not sure how. The camera's flash fired automatically in the low light, a brief strobe that illuminated the entire corner of the cemetery. For just an instant, I saw the creature in perfect detail, the massive shoulders, the intelligent eyes, the way it held itself with a dignity that was almost human. Then it was gone. Not running away, not disappearing behind a headstone, just gone, as if it had never been there at all. I stood there for a long moment, camera still raised, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing, but my hands were still shaking, and I could still smell something in the air, a mixture of wet earth and old copper that hadn't been there before. I looked at the camera's LCD screen to see if I'd captured anything. The image was there, but it was wrong. The flash had illuminated the cemetery perfectly, showing every detail of the headstones and trees, but where the creature had been standing, there was only empty space, not even a shadow to mark where it had been. I should have left then. Any reasonable person would have packed up their gear and driven back to town and tried to convince themselves it had been a trick of the light. But I'm a photographer, and photographers are curious by nature. I wanted to understand what I'd seen, wanted to find some rational explanation for the massive shape that had vanished like smoke. I walked over to where the creature had been standing. The ground between the headstones was soft from recent rain, and I could see my own footprints clearly in the dark earth. But there were no other tracks, no sign that anything else had been there. The grass wasn't even disturbed. That's when I heard the growl. It was low and deep, more felt than heard, like the rumble of distant thunder. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the ground beneath my feet, from the air around me, from the stones themselves. I spun around, looking for the source, but saw nothing except graves and gathering darkness. The growl came again, closer this time, and I finally accepted that I was in over my head. I packed my gear as quickly as my shaking hands would allow, and walked back to my car, trying not to run, trying not to look over my shoulder. But I could feel those red eyes watching me every step of the way. I drove straight to the nearest town and checked into a motel, even though it was barely 7 o'clock. I needed lights and people and the reassuring noise of civilization. I needed to convince myself that what I'd experienced was just an overactive imagination combined with the spooky atmosphere of an old cemetery. But when I developed the film the next week, I found something that changed my mind. The photograph I'd taken showed the cemetery exactly as I remembered it, headstones and trees and little evening shadows. But in the corner of the frame, barely visible among the darker shadows, was a pair of red dots that seemed to glow with their own light. Eyes, watching the camera with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware. I started researching the Valle Crucis area, looking for any mention of unusual wildlife or local legends that might explain what I'd encountered. That's when I found the stories about the demon dog, tales that went back more than a century of a massive black canine that guarded the cemetery at St. John's Church. The accounts were remarkably consistent across different time periods and witnesses. The creature was always described as enormous, always black, always possessed of those terrible glowing red eyes. It appeared most often to people who visited the cemetery after dark, and it seemed to distinguish between those who came with respectful intentions and those who didn't. I found newspaper clippings from the 1890s describing encounters with the creature, church records that mentioned parishioners reporting strange sightings, and family histories that included stories passed down through generations of local residents. All of them described essentially the same thing I had seen, a supernatural guardian that protected the sacred ground of the cemetery. Dr. Rebecca Adams at Appalachian State University had been studying the phenomenon for years. When I contacted her and described my experience, she wasn't surprised. "You're not the first photographer to encounter the Guardian," she told me. "And you won't be the last. It seems particularly drawn to people who are documenting the cemetery, as if it wants to make sure they understand the significance of the place." She explained that the Cherokee people had considered the Valle Crucis area sacred long before European settlers arrived. According to their traditions, certain locations served as crossing points between the physical world and the spirit realm, and these places often attracted guardian entities that protected the boundary between worlds. "The demon dog isn't malevolent," Dr. Adams said. "It's protective. It appears to people who need to be reminded that they're on sacred ground, that they need to approach the place with appropriate respect and reverence." I've been back to Valle Crucis many times since that first encounter, always during daylight hours, always with a sense of respect for what I now understand to be a place of genuine spiritual significance. I've never seen the creature again, but I've felt its presence, a watchful awareness that follows me as I work among the graves. Other photographers and researchers have had their own encounters over the years. The stories are always similar: a massive black dog with glowing red eyes, a sense of being watched and evaluated, and the clear impression that the creature is there not to harm, but to protect. Some people think the demon dog is a manifestation of collective belief, a psychological phenomenon created by generations of stories and expectations. Others believe it's a genuine supernatural entity, a guardian spirit that has taken the form most likely to be understood and respected by the people who encounter it. I don't know which explanation is correct, and I'm not sure it matters. What I know is that Valle Crucis is a place where the boundary between the ordinary world and something else is thinner than usual. What I know is that there are forces in our world that demand respect and reverence, and that sometimes those forces make themselves known to people who need to be reminded of their presence. The photograph I took that evening hangs in my office now, those red dots barely visible in the corner of the frame. They serve as a reminder that there are mysteries in our world that can't be explained away, guardians that watch over sacred places, and encounters that change the way you see everything around you. Sometimes, when I'm editing photographs late at night, I think I can feel those red eyes watching me from the shadows at the edge of my vision. Not threatening, not malevolent, just watchful, making sure I remember the lesson I learned in that cemetery among the ancient stones. Some places are sacred. Some mysteries are meant to be respected rather than solved. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we encounter the guardians that protect those places and remind us of our responsibilities to the sacred dimensions of the world around us. The Appalachian Trail stretches 2,290 miles from Georgia to Maine, winding through some of the most remote and beautiful wilderness in eastern America. I've hiked sections of it dozens of times over the years, and I thought I knew what to expect. Black bears, unpredictable weather, the occasional sketchy character at trail shelters. I was wrong. It was late September when I started a solo section hike through Virginia, planning to cover about 150 miles over 10 days. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the trail was mostly empty except for a few serious through hikers pushing toward Maine before winter set in. Perfect conditions for the kind of solitary wilderness experience I'd been craving. The first 3 days were exactly what I'd hoped for. Cool mornings, warm afternoons, the kind of silence you can only find miles from the nearest road. I fell into the rhythm that long-distance hikers know. Wake before dawn, hike until evening, sleep hard under a sky full of stars. It was on the 4th day that I first noticed I wasn't alone. I was making my way through a particularly remote section of trail, following a ridgeline that offered spectacular views of the valley below. When I got that feeling, you know the one, the prickle on the back of your neck that tells you someone's watching. I stopped and looked around, scanning the forest on both sides of the trail, but saw nothing except trees and shadows. I chalked it up to paranoia and kept hiking. but the feeling persisted, and by afternoon I was genuinely unsettled. Every time I stopped to rest or check my map, I had the distinct impression that something was observing me from just out of sight. When I walked, I could swear I heard footsteps behind me, matching my pace but stopping whenever I stopped. That night, I camped at a designated shelter area, a 3-sided wooden structure that provided some protection from the elements. I wasn't alone. 2 other hikers had arrived before me. A married couple from Ohio who were doing a week-long section hike. We shared dinner and swapped stories about the trail, and I almost forgot about the feeling of being watched. Almost. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of something moving around the shelter. At first, I thought it might be a bear investigating our food, which we'd properly hung in a bear bag 20 feet from the shelter. But the movement was too deliberate, too careful. Whatever was out there was trying not to wake us. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the soft sounds of something examining our gear. Footsteps circled the shelter slowly, pausing occasionally as if the visitor was studying something of particular interest. I wanted to look, but some primitive instinct kept me perfectly still, eyes closed, breathing steady. The sounds continued for about an hour before finally fading away. In the morning, I found evidence that our campsite had indeed been visited during the night. My hiking boots, which I'd left outside the shelter, had been moved about 10 feet away and arranged in a precise line. The couple's gear had been similarly rearranged, though nothing was missing or damaged. Probably just a curious bear, the husband said, though he looked as unsettled as I felt. They're smart animals. Sometimes they investigate campsites without causing any real trouble. I wanted to believe him, but I'd camped in bear country dozens of times, and this felt different. Bears are messy investigators. They knock things over, leave tracks, scatter gear around as they search for food. Whatever had visited us had been methodical, almost respectful in the way it had examined our belongings. The couple left early that morning, heading south toward a road crossing where they'd arranged to be picked up. I continued north, deeper into the wilderness, and that's when things really started to get strange. The feeling of being watched intensified throughout the day. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The normal sounds of the woods, bird calls, rustling leaves, the distant crash of a falling branch, seemed muted, as if something was dampening the natural acoustics of the forest. Around midday, I stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook and found something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the dirt beside the trail marker was a crude drawing that seemed to depict a human figure walking along a path, followed by a larger, more ambiguous shape. The scratches were fresh, made recently, and they were too precise to be random marks left by animals. I took a photo of the drawing with my phone, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I thought I'd need evidence later, proof that I wasn't losing my mind. The image was disturbing in its simplicity. Just a few lines scratched in the dirt, but they told a story that made my hands shake as I packed up my lunch. That afternoon, I started finding more drawings. They appeared at trail junctions, beside stream crossings, carved into tree bark or scratched into patches of bare earth. Always the same basic image, a human figure being followed by something larger and less defined. The artistic skill varied, but the message was consistent and increasingly detailed. Some of the drawings included what looked like geographical features, mountains, streams, trail markers. Others showed the human figure in different poses, sometimes walking, sometimes running, sometimes lying still. The implications were clear, and they were terrifying. By evening, I was seriously considering abandoning my hike and hiking out to the nearest road. But I was 3 days from any major trail crossing, and the thought of spending another night alone in the woods was almost as frightening as the idea of continuing forward. I found a campsite beside a small stream and set up my tent with shaking hands. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified: the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the trees. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again, circling my campsite with the same deliberate care I'd noticed at the shelter. This time, I worked up the courage to look. I unzipped my tent fly, slowly, quietly, and peered out into the darkness. My headlamp was within reach, but some instinct told me not to use it. Instead, I let my eyes adjust to the starlight and tried to make out shapes in the gloom. There was something there. A dark form moving between the trees, too large to be human, too upright to be a bear. It moved with a fluid grace that reminded me of water flowing around obstacles, never making a sound despite its obvious size. When it paused beside a large oak tree about 30 feet from my tent, I could see it more clearly. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and covered in what looked like dark fur or hair. Its proportions were wrong for any animal I knew, with arms that seemed too long and a torso that was too narrow. When it turned its head in my direction, I caught a glimpse of eyes that reflected the starlight like mirrors. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then it stepped back into the deeper shadows and was gone, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. The next morning, I found more evidence of my nocturnal visitor. The ground around my campsite was marked with footprints that were unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were large, maybe 18 inches long, and showed what looked like toes or claws at the front. But the stride pattern was wrong for any four-legged animal, suggesting something that walked upright. More disturbing were the new drawings I found scratched into the dirt around my tent. These were more detailed than the previous ones, showing the human figure lying in what was clearly meant to be a tent, with a larger shape standing nearby. The message was unmistakable. I know where you are. I know when you sleep. I packed up as quickly as possible and started hiking north, hoping to reach a road crossing before another night fell. But as the day progressed, it became clear that whatever was following me had no intention of letting me leave easily. The drawings appeared more frequently now, sometimes carved into trees directly beside the trail, impossible to miss. The most disturbing one appeared around noon, scratched into the wooden surface of a trail sign that marked the distance to various landmarks. It showed the human figure, but this time it included details that were clearly specific to me. My backpack, my hiking poles, even what looked like my distinctive red baseball cap. Below the figure was another drawing that took me a moment to interpret. It was a name. Sarah. I'd never mentioned that name to anyone on the trail, never written it in any trail register, or said it out loud. But it was the name of my ex-girlfriend, the woman I'd been hiking to forget, the reason I'd chosen to spend 10 days. Alone in the wilderness instead of dealing with the mess my personal life had become. How could whatever was following me know about Sarah? I started hiking faster, pushing myself harder than I should have, desperate to reach civilization before nightfall. But the trail seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me, and the afternoon shadows were growing longer when I finally accepted that I'd have to spend another night in the woods. I found a campsite near a stream, hoping the running water might provide some psychological comfort. As I set up my tent, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Across the stream, maybe 50 yards away, someone had built what looked like a cairn, a carefully stacked pile of stones that served no obvious purpose. But as I looked more closely, I realized it wasn't just a random stack of rocks. The stones were arranged in a pattern that looked almost like a crude sculpture of a human figure. And beside it, scratched into the sandy bank of the stream, was another drawing. This one showed 2 human figures. One was clearly meant to be me, recognizable by the same details that had appeared in the previous drawing. The other was smaller, with long hair and features that, despite the crude artistry, were unmistakably feminine. It was Sarah. Somehow, whatever was stalking me through the wilderness knew about Sarah, knew what she looked like, Knew that she was the reason I was out here alone, trying to hike away from memories that followed me wherever I went. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my tent with my headlamp on, listening to footsteps that circled my campsite until dawn. Sometimes they came close enough that I could hear breathing outside the thin nylon walls of my tent. Sometimes I heard what sounded like scratching, as if something was drawing in the dirt just inches from where I sat. When morning finally came, I found the most elaborate display yet. The ground around my tent was covered with drawings, dozens of them, scratched into every available patch of dirt. They told a story in crude pictographs, starting with images of Sarah and me together, progressing through what looked like arguments and separation, and ending with me alone on the trail. But the final drawing was different from all the others. It showed three figures, me, Sarah, and something else. Something large and dark that stood between us, its arms reaching out to touch both of our smaller forms. Below this image, scratched in letters that were barely legible, was a single word: together. I packed up my gear and hiked out as fast as my legs could carry me, not stopping until I reached a road crossing where I could call for a ride back to civilization. I never finished that section of the trail, and I've never been back to that particular stretch of the Appalachian Mountains. But the story doesn't end there. 3 months later, I got a phone call from Sarah. We hadn't spoken since our breakup, and hearing her voice was like getting punched in the stomach. She was crying, barely coherent, but she managed to tell me something that made my blood run cold. She'd been having dreams, she said. Dreams about hiking on a trail she'd never seen before, being followed by something dark and patient. In the dreams, she was looking for someone, looking for me. And whatever was following her was helping, guiding her along paths that led deeper into wilderness she didn't recognize. It knows about us, she whispered into the phone. It knows what we meant to each other, and it wants us to be together. It's been showing me the way. I tried to convince her that they were just dreams, stress-induced fantasies brought on by our breakup and the emotional turmoil that followed. But she insisted they were more than that. She'd started researching the Appalachian Trail, studying maps and guidebooks, planning a hiking trip to the same section where I'd had my encounter. I have to go, she said. It's calling to me. I can feel it pulling at me, showing me the way back to you. I begged her not to go, tried to explain about the drawings and the footprints and the thing that had stalked me through the wilderness. But she'd already made up her mind. She was going to hike that section of trail, going to find whatever was out there waiting, going to let it guide her to whatever reunion it had planned for us. That was 6 months ago. Sarah never came back from her hike. The search and rescue teams found her car at a trailhead, her gear missing, no sign of where she'd gone or what had happened to her. The official report listed her as a missing person, probably lost in the wilderness, case still open but growing colder every day. But I know better. I know she found what she was looking for out there in the deep woods of Appalachia. I know something guided her along trails that don't appear on any map, led her to places where the normal rules don't apply, where the boundary between the living and something else becomes thin enough to cross. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about going back to that section of trail. I think about hiking into the wilderness with my backpack and my gear and my memories of Sarah, following the same path she took, looking for the drawings that might lead me to whatever reunion waits in the deep places of the mountains. But I never do, because I'm afraid of what I might find out there. I'm afraid that Sarah is still hiking, still following something dark and patient through wilderness that exists outside our normal understanding of space and time. And I'm afraid that if I go looking for her, I might find exactly what I'm looking for. The Appalachian Trail stretches 2,190 miles from Georgia to Maine. But some sections of it, I've learned, lead to places that aren't on any map, and some of the things you encounter in the deep wilderness aren't content to let you hike away and forget what you've seen. They follow you. They learn about you. They find ways to bring you back. And sometimes They use the people you love to make sure you never really escape. Moving to our final and perhaps most disturbing story, we enter the realm of documented supernatural possession and poltergeist activity that terrorized a mountain family in the early 1900s and attracted national attention from paranormal investigators, religious leaders, and even the wife of the famous magician Harry Houdini. My great-grandfather was there the night it started. He was one of the men digging graves in the cemetery outside Clendenin when they saw the thing flying overhead, but that's a different story, for a different time. What I want to tell you about happened 3 years later in 1904 when he was working as a carpenter in the remote mountains of Tennessee. Powell Mountain rises like a sleeping giant from the surrounding valleys, its forested slopes creating a landscape that feels untouched by time. In the early 1900s, scattered families lived in cabins carved from the mountain itself, surviving through subsistence farming and the occasional cash crop. It was hard country that bred hard people, folks who didn't have much patience for things they couldn't understand or control. That's what made what happened to the Bell family so extraordinary. My great-grandfather, Thomas Whitmore, had been hired to do some repair work on the Bell cabin, replacing rotted floorboards and fixing a section of roof that had been damaged in a winter storm. The Bells were typical mountain folk, practical, religious, and skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained by hard work and common sense. John Bell was a farmer and part-time preacher. His wife, Mary, kept house and raised their children, including their 12-year-old daughter, Bertha. Bertha was what people back then called a spirited child, bright, curious, maybe a little too independent for her own good. She helped her mother with the household chores and looked after her younger siblings with the kind of competence that mountain children develop early. There was nothing unusual about her, nothing that would have prepared anyone for what was about to happen. My great-grandfather was working on the cabin's front porch when the phenomena began. It was a cold February night, and the family had gone to bed early to conserve lamp oil. He was staying in a small outbuilding behind the main cabin, and he'd just settled down for the night when he heard the noise. Thump, thump, thump. Rhythmic, heavy, like someone dropping a sack of grain on a wooden floor, but the sound was coming from inside the main cabin, and it was loud enough to shake the walls. My great-grandfather got dressed and walked over to investigate, thinking maybe one of the children had fallen out of bed or there'd been some kind of accident. He found the Bell family standing in their nightclothes outside Bertha's bedroom, staring at the closed door with expressions of terror and confusion. The thumping was coming from inside the room, so violent that it was making the entire cabin shake. John Bell had his hand on the door latch, but he seemed afraid to open it. "It's Bertha's bed," Mary Bell whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise. "It's bouncing up and down like there's a team of horses under it." My great-grandfather pushed past them and opened the door. What he saw inside that room challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. Bertha's bed, a massive oak frame that must have weighed 200 pounds, was bouncing completely off the floor, not rocking back and forth or sliding around, but actually leaving the ground and slamming back down, with enough force to crack the floorboards beneath it. The bed would rise 3 or 4 feet in the air, hover for a moment as if suspended by invisible hands, then crash down with a sound like thunder. And through it all, Bertha lay perfectly still in the center of the mattress, apparently unconscious, completely unaffected by the violent motion that should have thrown her against the walls or onto the floor. "How long has this been going on?" my great-grandfather asked. "About an hour," John Bell replied, his voice shaking. "We heard the noise and came to check on her, but she won't wake up. It's like she's in some kind of trance." They tried everything they could think of to stop the bouncing. John Bell grabbed one corner of the bed frame, trying to hold it down, but the force that was moving it was too strong. The bed continued its violent motion, dragging him along until he had to let go or risk being injured. They tried calling Bertha's name, shaking her gently, even splashing water on her face. Nothing worked. She remained unconscious, breathing normally but completely unresponsive to the chaos surrounding her. The bouncing continued until dawn. For 7 straight hours, that massive bed rose and fell with mechanical precision, never varying its rhythm, never showing any signs of slowing down. When the sun finally came up, the motion stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Bertha opened her eyes, sat up, and asked what everyone was doing in her room. She had no memory of what had happened during the night. As far as she knew, she'd gone to sleep normally and woken up to find her family and a stranger staring at her. When they tried to explain about the bouncing bed, she looked at them like they'd lost their minds. "You must have been dreaming," she said. "My bed doesn't bounce." But the evidence was impossible to ignore. The floorboards beneath the bed were cracked and splintered from the repeated impacts. The bed frame itself showed signs of stress, with joints that had been loosened by the violent motion, and everyone in the room had witnessed the same impossible phenomenon. The next night, it happened again. My great-grandfather had planned to leave that morning, his repair work completed, but John Bell begged him to stay another night. "I need a witness," he said. "Someone who ain't family, someone people will believe when they hear about this." So my great-grandfather stayed, and he got to witness the full horror of what came to be known as the Bouncing Bertha phenomenon. The bed began its violent motion around the same time as the previous night, and once again it continued until dawn. But this time, the manifestation was even more intense. The bed didn't just bounce. It spun, twisted, and moved around the room as if it were being manipulated by invisible hands. Sometimes it would rise so high that it struck the ceiling beams, leaving gouges in the wood. Sometimes it would tilt at impossible angles, defying gravity in ways that made no sense according to any natural law. And through it all, Bertha remained unconscious and unharmed, her body somehow protected from the violent forces that were tossing her bed around like a child's toy. Word of the phenomenon spread quickly through the isolated mountain community. By the end of the week, people were coming from miles around to witness the impossible spectacle. Ministers arrived to pray over the child and attempt exorcisms. Doctors came to examine Bertha and try to find a medical explanation for what was happening. Newspaper reporters made the difficult journey to the remote mountain cabin to document the events for their readers. My great-grandfather stayed for 2 weeks, serving as both witness and unofficial record keeper for the stream of visitors who came to see the bouncing bed. He kept a journal of the events, noting the exact times when the phenomena began and ended, the intensity of the manifestations, and the reactions of the various investigators who came to study the case. According to his notes, the bouncing occurred every night for 35 consecutive nights. It always began around 10 p.m. and continued until dawn, never varying its schedule by more than a few minutes. The intensity varied from night to night. Sometimes the bed would bounce gently, rising only a few inches off the floor, while other nights it would slam against the ceiling with enough force to shake the entire cabin. The most disturbing aspect of the phenomenon, according to my great-grandfather's journal, was Bertha's complete disconnection from what was happening to her. She would fall asleep normally each evening, and once the bouncing began, nothing could wake her. She didn't respond to loud noises, physical contact, or even being lifted from the bed and carried to another room. The moment she was placed on any other surface, she would immediately fall into the same deep, unnatural sleep. But if she was returned to her own bed, she would remain unconscious and motionless while the violent bouncing continued around her. It was as if she existed in a separate reality from the supernatural forces that were manipulating her sleeping environment. The investigators who came to study the case represented a cross-section of early 20th century America's intellectual and religious leadership. University professors arrived with measuring instruments and cameras, trying to document the phenomenon scientifically. Baptist preachers came with Bibles and holy water, attempting to drive out what they assumed were demonic forces. Medical doctors examined Bertha thoroughly, looking for signs of epilepsy, hysteria, or other conditions that might explain her behavior. None of them found answers that satisfied everyone, but all of them confirmed that the phenomenon was real and defied conventional explanation. Dr. James Morrison, a professor from the University of Tennessee, spent 3 nights at the cabin and later published a detailed account of his observations in a scientific journal. He measured the height of the bed's bouncing up to 4 feet on the most active nights, calculated the force required to move the massive oak frame, equivalent to several grown men lifting in perfect synchronization, and used a primitive camera to attempt to photograph the phenomenon. His photographs showed the bed in various stages of motion, but they also revealed something that disturbed him more than the bouncing itself. In several images, Bertha's body appeared to be contorted in ways that should have been impossible without serious injury. Her spine would be bent at extreme angles, her limbs twisted into positions that no conscious person could have maintained. Yet she showed no signs of pain or distress, and medical examinations the next morning never revealed any injuries. The religious investigators had their own theories about what was causing the phenomenon. Most of the ministers who visited the cabin concluded that Bertha was the victim of demonic possession or supernatural attack. They performed various rituals designed to drive away evil spirits, including prayer vigils, holy water blessings, and formal exorcisms. Interestingly, some of these interventions seem to have temporary effects on the intensity of the manifestations. When a Bible was placed under Bertha's pillow, the bouncing would sometimes become gentler, though it never stopped entirely. When groups of people gathered around the bed to pray, the violent motion would occasionally pause for several minutes before resuming. The most successful religious intervention came from an itinerant Baptist preacher named Reverend Samuel Hayes, who spent an entire week at the cabin conducting what he called a spiritual warfare against the forces tormenting the child. Under his influence, the bouncing became noticeably less violent, though it continued to occur every night. Reverend Hayes claimed that he could sense the presence of a malevolent spiritual entity that had somehow attached itself to Bertha, feeding off her youth and innocence while using her as a conduit for its manifestations in the physical world. He believed that the entity was not truly demonic, but rather the spirit of someone who had died in great anguish and was now seeking to communicate with the living through the only means available to it. The case attracted so much attention that plans were made for Bess Houdini, the wife of the famous magician Harry Houdini, to visit the mountain cabin and investigate the phenomenon personally. Mrs. Houdini was known for her interest in spiritualism and her efforts to debunk fraudulent psychic phenomena. Her potential involvement would have brought even greater national attention to the Bouncing Bertha case. However, these plans were cancelled when the phenomenon suddenly stopped after 35 nights of continuous activity. On the morning of March 28, 1904, Bertha woke up normally, with full awareness of her surroundings and no memory of the supernatural events that had been occurring around her for over a month. When her parents tried to explain what had been happening, she initially refused to believe them. It was only when they showed her the damage to her bedroom, the cracked floorboards, the gouged ceiling beams, the loosened bed frame, that she began to accept that something extraordinary had been taking place while she slept. The end of the phenomena was as mysterious as its beginning. There was no final dramatic manifestation, no apparent resolution or explanation for why it had started or why it stopped. Bertha simply returned to normal sleep patterns, and her bed remained motionless through the night. My great-grandfather stayed for another week, hoping to witness any return of the supernatural activity, but nothing happened. Bertha slept peacefully. The bed remained still, and life in the Bell cabin gradually returned to normal. The long-term effects of the Bouncing Bertha phenomenon on the family were significant and lasting. The cabin had been severely damaged by the 35 nights of violent supernatural activity. The floorboards in Bertha's room had to be completely replaced, the ceiling beams required extensive repairs, and the bed frame was so loosened by the constant motion that it eventually had to be rebuilt. More significantly, the psychological impact on the family was profound. John and Mary Bell had witnessed something that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality and their religious beliefs. They had seen their daughter subjected to forces beyond human comprehension, and they had been powerless to protect her or stop what was happening. Bertha herself seemed remarkably unaffected by the experience, at least consciously. She had no memory of the supernatural events and showed no signs of trauma or lasting psychological damage. She continued to develop normally, eventually marrying and raising a family of her own in the same mountain community where she had experienced her extraordinary childhood encounter with the supernatural. However, family members noted that she always seemed slightly different after the bouncing stopped. More serious, more thoughtful, as if some part of her had been touched by forces from beyond the normal world. She never spoke about the events publicly, but she would sometimes wake from dreams that she couldn't remember, with tears on her face and a sadness she couldn't explain. My great-grandfather's journal of the bouncing Bertha case became a family heirloom, passed down through generations of Whitmores who preserved the account of those 35 nights when the natural world seemed to suspend its laws for reasons no one could understand. The journal contains detailed descriptions of each night's manifestations, sketches of the bed in various positions, and transcripts of interviews with the various investigators who came to study the phenomenon. Reading through those yellowed pages now, more than a century later, I'm struck by the matter-of-fact tone my great-grandfather used to describe events that should have been impossible. He wrote about the bouncing bed and Bertha's supernatural trances, with the same practical attention to detail he used to describe his carpentry work, as if documenting the impossible was just another job that needed to be done properly. The bouncing Bertha case influenced the development of modern paranormal investigation techniques and established many of the protocols that researchers still use today when studying supernatural phenomena. The case demonstrated the importance of having multiple credible witnesses, the value of detailed documentation and measurement, and the need for careful analysis of both the physical and psychological factors that might contribute to such events. Modern researchers who have studied the case note that it contains many elements consistent with other well-documented cases of poltergeist activity involving children and adolescents. The focus of the phenomena on a specific individual, the violent and destructive nature of the manifestations, and the apparent connection to psychological or emotional stress all fit established patterns in paranormal research. However, the bouncing Bertha case was unusual in several important ways. The duration of the phenomena, 35 consecutive nights, was much longer than most poltergeist cases. The intensity of the manifestations, with a 200-pound bed bouncing 4 feet off the floor, exceeded anything reported in most similar cases. And the complete disconnection between Bertha's conscious awareness and the supernatural events surrounding her was more extreme than typically observed in poltergeist research. The case also raised important questions about the relationship between consciousness and supernatural phenomena. If Bertha was somehow unconsciously causing the bouncing through psychokinetic abilities, why did she have no awareness of what was happening? If external supernatural forces were responsible, why did they focus on her specifically, and why did they stop as suddenly as they had begun? These questions remain unanswered more than a century later. The bouncing Bertha case continues to challenge our understanding of what is possible in our world. Whether one believes in the literal truth of the supernatural events or seeks alternative explanations for what dozens of credible witnesses reported seeing, the case remains a powerful testament to the enduring human fascination with mysteries that transcend our ordinary experience of reality. The mountain cabin where the events took place is long gone, replaced by modern development that has transformed much of Powell Mountain. But the story lives on in family histories and local folklore, a reminder that even in our age of scientific rationalism and technological advancement, there are still phenomena that resist easy explanation. Sometimes, late at night when the house settles around me and I'm reading through my great-grandfather's journal by lamplight, I can almost hear the echo of that rhythmic thumping that terrorized a mountain family more than a century ago. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of something impossible making itself known in our world, demanding to be witnessed and remembered and passed down through generations of storytellers who understand that some mysteries are too important to be forgotten. The bouncing Bertha phenomenon stands as one of the most extraordinary and well-documented examples of supernatural activity in American history. It reminds us that there are forces in our world that operate according to laws we don't understand, and that sometimes those forces choose to manifest in ways that challenge everything we think we know about the nature of reality itself. And there you have it. 11 of the most terrifying, documented and verified horror stories from the ancient mountains of Appalachia, each one backed by historical records, multiple witnesses, and evidence that continues to baffle investigators to this day. From the Bell Witch's supernatural murder to the bouncing Bertha phenomenon that defied the laws of physics, these aren't just campfire tales or urban legends. These are real events that happened to real people in a region where the veil between our world and something far more sinister has always been dangerously thin. But this is just the beginning of our journey into the dark heart of America's most haunted region. The mountains remember everything, and sometimes they decide to remind us that there are forces in this world that we're not meant to understand. Some say these stories ended with the dawn of the modern age. But I still wake up screaming, knowing that in the deepest hollows and highest peaks of Appalachia, something ancient and terrible continues to watch and wait. Thanks for listening, if you made it through the darkness.